The patrol ship moved slowly through the dark space near the Catherine Nebula. Commander Veltris stood at the viewing window and watched the clouds of purple and blue gas drift past. He had made this journey many times before. Nothing ever happened here. Nothing ever changed. Veltris was old by the standards of most species. He had lived for 230 years, and he had seen many things in that time. He had watched empires rise and fall. He had seen stars die and new ones born. He had met hundreds of different species, learned their languages, studied their customs, and watched them struggle against the universe. The universe always won in the end. This was something Veltris understood deeply. Every species, no matter how strong or clever, eventually accepted their limits. They learned to bow to fate. They learned that some things could not be changed. His people, the Shara, had learned this lesson long ago. They did not fight against impossible odds. They did not rage against death. They accepted what was, and they found peace in that acceptance. It was the only logical way to live. The alarm began to sound. Veltris turned from the window and looked at the display screen. His second officer, a young female named Kira, was already working at her station. "Commander," she said, "we are detecting wreckage. A ship has been destroyed here recently." Veltris walked to her station and looked at the data. The wreckage was scattered across a large area of space. Whatever had happened, it had happened violently. The ship had been torn apart. What kind of ship? He asked. Kira worked at her controls. "Human?" she said. "A transport vessel. Medium size. It was carrying supplies to one of their colony worlds." Veltris felt nothing at this news. Humans were a minor species. They had only been traveling among the stars for a few hundred years. They were small, fragile, and short-lived. Most of them died before they reached 100 years of age. The Shara considered them to be like children, always running and shouting and getting themselves into trouble. "Are there survivors?" he asked. Kira scanned the wreckage. "Unlikely," she said. "The damage is extensive. However, I am detecting a weak signal. It could be an emergency pod." Veltris considered this. The collective's laws were clear on such matters. When a Shara vessel found survivors in space, they were required to rescue them. The rescuer then became responsible for the survivor until they could be returned to their own people. It was called the duty of care, and it was taken very seriously. "Take us closer," Veltris ordered. "If there are survivors, we must help them." The patrol ship moved through the wreckage. Twisted metal and broken glass floated past the windows. Veltris saw frozen bodies drifting in the void, humans who had died when their ship was destroyed. He felt a small measure of sadness for them, but nothing more. Death came for all living things. It was not something to be mourned. They found the emergency pod wedged between two large pieces of debris. It was small, barely big enough for a single person. The outer shell was cracked, and frost had formed on the viewing window. "Life signs?" Veltris asked. Kira studied her readings. "Yes," she said, but her voice was uncertain. "Barely. The human inside is alive, but only just. His injuries are severe." They brought the pod aboard the ship. Veltris went to the medical bay to see the survivor for himself. The medical team had already opened the pod and pulled the human out. He lay on a treatment table, and the medical AI was scanning his body. Veltris looked at the human. He was a male, perhaps 30 years old by human counting. He had brown hair that was matted with blood, and his skin was pale from blood loss. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was shallow. "What is his condition?" Veltris asked the medical AI. The AI's voice was calm and emotionless. "The patient has suffered multiple critical injuries. His spine is fractured in 3 places. Both lungs have been punctured. He has internal bleeding in his abdomen. His left arm has been crushed, and several bones are broken. Based on these injuries, His probability of survival is 2.7%. Veltries looked at the broken human on the table. Less than 3% chance of living. By all logical measures, this man was already dead. His body simply had not accepted it yet. "Do what you can for him," Veltries said. "It is our duty." The medical team worked through the night. They performed surgery after surgery, repairing damaged organs and setting broken bones. Veltries watched from the observation room above, not because he expected the human to survive, but because it was his duty to witness. The human's heart stopped twice during the night. Both times, the medical team brought him back. Both times, Veltries expected it to be the end. But the human kept breathing. By morning, the surgeries were complete. The human lay in a recovery bed, wrapped in bandages and connected to dozens of machines. He looked like he was already dead. "He will not last the day," the chief medical officer told Veltries. "His body has suffered too much damage. I recommend we make him comfortable and allow him to pass with dignity." Veltries agreed. It was the logical choice. There was no point in prolonging the inevitable. But the human did not die that day. He did not die the next day either. On the third day, Veltries began to feel something he had not felt in many years. He felt curious. The medical team could not explain it. The human's injuries were beyond what any body should be able to heal. His spine was shattered. His organs were failing. By every measure of medical science, he should have been dead many times over. But he kept breathing. On the seventh day, the human opened his eyes. Veltries was in the medical bay when it happened. He had been reviewing the daily reports when he heard a sound from the recovery bed. He looked up and saw the human staring at him. The human's eyes were brown and clear. There was no confusion in them, no fear. He looked at Veltries with a calm awareness that seemed impossible for someone who had just woken from death. "Where am I?" the human asked. His voice was weak, but steady. Veltries walked to the bedside. "You are aboard a Shi'ar patrol vessel," he said. "I am Commander Veltries. We found you in the wreckage of your ship." The human nodded slowly. "The others?" "You were the only survivor." The human closed his eyes for a moment. Veltries expected to see grief, perhaps despair. Instead, when the human opened his eyes again, there was only quiet determination. "When can I start physical therapy?" the human asked. Veltries did not understand the question. "Physical therapy?" "To help me walk again. Move my arms. I need to get my strength back." Veltries stared at the human. He had just been told that everyone he knew was dead. His body was broken beyond repair. The medical AI had calculated that he would never walk again, never use his left arm again, possibly never leave that bed again. And his first concern was when he could start working to recover. "What is your name?" Veltries asked. "Daniel," the human said. "Daniel Carter." Veltries looked at Daniel Carter. This broken human who refused to accept what the universe had done to him, and felt something stir in his chest. It was the beginning of something. Veltries did not yet understand. It was the beginning of a story that would change everything he believed. The days turned into weeks, and Daniel Carter refused to die. Veltries watched him with growing fascination. The medical team had explained to Daniel very clearly what his situation was. His spine was damaged beyond repair. His left arm would never function properly again. He would be lucky to sit up in bed without help. Walking was impossible. Daniel listened to all of this. He nodded politely. He thanked them for their honesty. Then he asked for a rehabilitation frame. The rehabilitation frame was a machine that helped patients learn to move again after injuries. It used mechanical supports to hold the body upright while the patient tried to take steps. It was designed for minor injuries, for people who needed a little help getting back on their feet. It was not designed for someone with a shattered spine. The medical team tried to refuse. They said it would be cruel to give Daniel false hope. They said he would only hurt himself more. Daniel kept asking. Finally, Veltries ordered them to give him the frame. He told himself it was because the duty of care required him to honor the survivors' wishes. But deep inside, he knew the real reason. He wanted to see what would happen. On the first day, Daniel could not even stand. The frame held him upright, but his legs would not respond. His left arm hung at his side, useless. The medical AI recorded his attempt and calculated that he had made no progress. Daniel tried again. On the second day, he managed to twitch the toes on his right foot. It was such a small movement that the sensors barely detected it. But Daniel smiled when he felt it happen. "That is progress," he said. Veltries did not understand how such a tiny movement could be considered progress. The human still could not stand, could not walk, could barely move at all. But Daniel seemed genuinely happy about that small twitch. The weeks continued. Daniel fell from the rehabilitation frame 412 times. Veltries counted each fall. He watched through the medical bay windows as the human crashed to the floor again and again. Each time, Daniel's hands would bleed from catching himself. Each time, the medical staff would rush to help him up. Each time, Daniel would wave them away and pull himself back up on his own. "Why do you keep trying?" Veltries asked him one evening. Daniel was lying on his recovery bed, exhausted from another day of failed attempts. His hands were wrapped in bandages, and his body was covered in bruises from falling. He should have looked defeated. Instead, his eyes were bright with something Veltries could not name. "Because I have to get home," Daniel said. "Home? I have a sister. Her name is Katie. She lives on Haven Colony, out near the border. I promised her I would come back." Veltries considered this. Haven Colony was very far away on the other side of the galaxy. The journey would take years, even with the fastest ships. And Daniel was in no condition to travel anywhere. "Your sister likely believes you are dead," Veltries said. "Your ship was destroyed. No one sent a distress signal. There is no reason for anyone to believe you survived." Daniel nodded. "Probably. Then why continue? Why put yourself through this pain for a promise that no longer matters?" Daniel turned his head and looked directly at Veltries. His brown eyes were steady and calm. "A promise is a promise," he said. "It does not stop mattering just because things get hard." Veltries had no answer to this. He left the medical bay that night feeling confused in a way he had not felt for many decades. The Shi'ar believed in accepting fate. When something was impossible, you did not waste energy fighting against it. You found peace in what was, not in what you wished could be. But Daniel Carter did not seem to understand this. He acted as if the universe's rules did not apply to him. He acted as if he could simply decide what was possible and what was not. It was foolish. It was illogical. No. It went against everything Veltries had learned in 200 years of life. And yet, something about it made Veltries feel strange emotions he could not name. The months passed. Daniel learned to stand on his own. It took him 2 months of constant effort, 2 months of falling and bleeding and getting back up again. The medical team said it was impossible. The medical AI recalculated his probability of recovery 17 times. And each time it came back near zero. Daniel did not care about probabilities. On the day he took his first step without the frame, Veltries was there to see it. Daniel's left leg dragged slightly, and his body shook with effort. But he moved forward, 1 step, then another, then another. He walked 10 steps before he collapsed. The medical staff rushed to help him, but Daniel was laughing. He lay on the floor of the medical bay, his body broken and exhausted, and he laughed with pure joy. "Did you see that?" He called out to Veltries. 10 steps. Tomorrow I will do 20. He did 20 the next day. He did 50 the day after that. By the end of the 3rd month, Daniel was walking the halls of the ship on his own. His gait was uneven, and he needed to rest often, but he was walking. He was doing something every medical expert had said was impossible. Veltris found himself visiting Daniel's quarters each evening. He told himself it was his duty to check on the survivor in his care. But he knew the truth. He was fascinated by this human who refused to accept limits. They talked for hours during those evening visits. Daniel told Veltris about his life before the accident. He had been an engineer on the transport ship, responsible for keeping the engines running. He had grown up on Earth in a small town in a place called Montana. He had 2 parents who had died when he was young, and a younger sister he had raised by himself. "Katie is smart," Daniel said one night. "Smarter than me. She got a job on Haven Colony as a research scientist. She studies alien plants, tries to figure out if they can be used for medicine. You are proud of her," Veltris observed. "Very proud. She worked hard to get where she is. I helped her when I could, but she did most of it herself." Daniel smiled. "She used to get so angry at me for being overprotective. She would say she could take care of herself. And she can. But I still worry about her. That is why you push yourself so hard." To return to her, Daniel nodded. "She's the only family I have left. I promised I would always come back. I do not break promises." Veltris thought about this conversation for many days afterward. He had never understood the human attachment to family. The Shara did not form such bonds. They were born, they lived, they died, all as individuals moving through the universe alone. But watching Daniel fight through impossible pain for the sake of one person, Veltris began to understand something. The humans were not strong because of their bodies. Their bodies were weak and fragile and broke easily. The humans were strong because they had something to fight for. By the 6th month, Daniel had regained most of his mobility. His left arm still did not work properly, and he walked with a slight limp, but he could move on his own. He could work. He could think. He was alive in ways the medical AI had said were impossible. Veltris submitted his report to the collective high command. He explained that the human survivor was recovering and would soon be able to be returned to his own people. He expected the response to be routine. Instead, he received news that would change everything. War had come to the border systems. The Vareth Dominion had launched an invasion, and Haven Colony was directly in their path. Veltris received the message on a quiet morning. He was in his quarters, reviewing routine reports when the priority signal came through. He opened it expecting news about supply routes or patrol schedules. Instead, he read about war. The Vareth Dominion had been a threat to the outer territories for many years. They were a warrior species, aggressive and expansionist, always looking for new worlds to conquer. The collective had maintained an uneasy peace with them through careful diplomacy and the threat of mutual destruction. That peace was now over. The Vareth had launched a massive invasion of the border systems. Their fleets were moving through human space, destroying everything in their path. Colony after colony was falling. The humans were fighting back, but they were outmatched. Their ships were slower, their weapons weaker, their numbers smaller. Veltris read the list of targeted worlds. His blood went cold when he saw the name, Haven Colony. He sat in silence for a long moment, thinking about what this meant. Then he stood up and walked to Daniel's quarters. Daniel was exercising when Veltris arrived. He had built a simple workout routine using equipment he had made himself from spare parts. He was doing push-ups on the floor, his body moving up and down with steady determination. His left arm was weaker than his right, but he pushed through the imbalance. "Commander," Daniel said, not stopping his exercise. "What brings you here so early?" Veltris did not know how to say what he needed to say. In 200 years, he had delivered many pieces of bad news. He had told parents their children were dead. He had told soldiers their wars were lost. He had learned to speak such words with calm detachment. But this was different. This was Daniel. "I have received news," Veltri said. "There is a war." Daniel stopped his exercise and stood up. He looked at Veltris with those calm brown eyes that never seemed to show fear. "What kind of war?" "The Varth Dominion has invaded the border systems. They are moving through human space." Daniel's expression did not change, but Veltris saw something shift in his eyes. A darkness. A worry. "Which systems?" Daniel asked. Veltris told him. When he said the name Haven Colony, Daniel went very still. He did not move, did not speak, did not even seem to breathe. He stood there like a statue, staring at nothing. "Katie," he said finally. His voice was barely a whisper. "I am sorry," Veltri said. "The collective has received reports that the colony is under threat. The Vareth fleet is approaching. The humans are trying to organize a defense, but..." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Daniel walked to the small window in his quarters and looked out at the stars. Veltris watched him, waiting for the reaction. He expected grief. He expected despair. He expected the human to finally break down and accept that the universe had beaten him. Daniel turned around. His eyes were not filled with grief. They were filled with fire. "I need a ship," he said. Veltris blinked. "What?" "A ship. Something fast. Something that can get me to Haven Colony before the Vareth arrive." "Daniel, that is impossible. Haven Colony is on the other side of the conflict zone. The Vareth have ships everywhere. The probability of reaching the colony alive is..." "I do not care about probability." Veltris stared at the human. Daniel was standing straight now, his shoulders back, his jaw set. He looked like a soldier preparing for battle. "The collective cannot get involved in this conflict," Veltris explained. "Our neutrality is sacred. If we send a ship into the war zone, we will be seen as taking sides. It could mean war for our people as well. I am not asking the collective to get involved. I am asking for a ship. One ship. For me, to do what? You are one human. You are not fully healed. What can you possibly do against an invasion fleet?" Daniel met his eyes. "I can try." Veltris felt a wave of frustration. This was exactly what he had always found strange about humans. They did not think logically. They did not accept when odds were against them. They just kept pushing forward, even when it made no sense. "The mathematics are clear," Veltri said. "I have had the tactical AI run the numbers. If you take a ship to Haven Colony, your probability of survival is 0.4%. Less than 1 in 200. You will die, Daniel. You will not reach your sister. You will not save anyone. You will just die alone in the void." Daniel listened to every word. He nodded slowly, as if considering what Veltris had said. Then he asked again. "I need a ship." Something inside Veltris cracked. He had spent 2 centuries watching species accept their fate. He had believed this was wisdom. He had believed that fighting against impossible odds was foolish, a waste of energy that could be spent finding peace. But standing here, looking at this human who had already died twice and refused to stay dead, Veltris felt his beliefs begin to shake. Daniel was not asking for help because he thought he would succeed. He was asking because his sister was in danger, and he could not sit and do nothing. He would rather die trying than live knowing he had given up. It was illogical. It was irrational. It went against everything the Shi'ar believed, and it was the most beautiful thing Veltris had ever seen. "There is a small scout ship in the lower hangar," Veltris heard himself say. "It is fast, and it has basic weapons. It is not designed for combat, but it could outrun most Vareth vessels." Daniel's eyes widened. "You will give it to me?" I am giving you nothing. The ship will be reported as missing. A malfunction in security systems. An accident. Daniel smiled. It was the first real smile Veltris had seen from him since the news arrived. Thank you, Commander. Veltris nodded. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. He stood there for a long moment, thinking about what he was about to do. It made no logical sense. It went against every protocol. It would probably get him removed from command. He turned back to face Daniel. The ship has 2 seats, he said. It will need a pilot who knows how to navigate Shire systems. Daniel stared at him. Commander? I have been watching you for 6 months, Veltri said. I have watched you refuse to die when you should have died. I have watched you walk when you should never have walked again. I have watched you fight against everything the universe has thrown at you. He stepped closer to Daniel. I have spent 200 years believing that fate could not be changed. I have spent 200 years accepting what was. And in 6 months, you have made me question everything I believed. Veltris took a deep breath. He was not sure if the Shara could feel what humans called hope. But standing here, looking at Daniel Carter, he felt something very close to it. I want to see what happens, he said. I want to see if a human can truly defy destiny. And I think the only way to find out is to stand beside you when you try. Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and clasped Veltris's arm in the human gesture of friendship. Then let us go save my sister, Daniel said. They left that night. Flying into the darkness toward a war they had almost no chance of surviving. And for the first time in 200 years, Veltris felt alive. The scout ship was small, barely large enough for 2 people to move around inside. It had a cockpit at the front with 2 seats, a tiny living area in the middle, and an engine room at the back that hummed with energy. The ship was named Starlight, but Daniel had started calling it Lucky. That is not a logical name, Veltris said as they flew through the first stretch of empty space. We are not relying on luck. We are relying on speed and careful planning. Daniel smiled from the weapons console. Sometimes luck is all you have left. Might as well give it a name. They entered the conflict zone on the 3rd day. Veltris had planned their route carefully. He knew the Varif patrol patterns from intelligence reports. He knew which areas of space were heavily guarded and which were left empty. He had calculated the safest path through the war zone, a winding route that would take them around the worst of the fighting. The first attack came. 12 hours later, 3 Varith fighters appeared on their sensors, fast and deadly. They had been hiding in an asteroid field, waiting for ships trying to slip through the blockade. The moment they spotted Lucky, they opened fire. Veltris threw the ship into a dive, dodging the first wave of energy blasts. The cockpit shook as explosions went off around them. Warning lights flashed across the control panels. They're faster than us, Veltris said. We cannot outrun them. Then we do not run, Daniel said. His hands moved across the weapons console, and Lucky's small guns began to fire. The battle lasted 11 minutes. Veltris flew the ship through maneuvers that should have been impossible for a craft its size. He dove between asteroids, spun through debris fields, and used the gravity of a nearby moon to slingshot away from pursuit. Daniel fired shot after shot, his aim steady despite the chaos around him. They destroyed 1 fighter. They damaged another. The 3rd broke off pursuit when its wingmates fell. When it was over, Veltris sat back in his seat and tried to slow his racing hearts. He had not been in combat for over a century. He had forgotten how terrifying it was. Daniel was already checking the damage reports. Shields are at 60%, he said. Minor hull damage on the starboard side. We can repair it if we find somewhere safe to stop. Veltris looked at the human. Daniel's face was calm, focused. He showed no fear, no panic. He simply looked at the problems in front of him and started solving them. How are you so calm? Veltris asked. Daniel glanced up from his console. What do you mean? We nearly died. We are flying through a war zone with no backup and no hope of rescue. If we are captured, the Vareth will kill us slowly. How can you sit there and review damage reports like nothing happened? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, when I was lying in that emergency pod after the crash, I had a lot of time to think. I was dying. I knew I was dying. And I thought about all the things I was afraid of, all the ways things could go wrong. He turned back to his console. I decided that fear was not useful. It does not help you survive. It just makes everything harder. So I let it go. You let it go? I still feel it sometimes. My heart beats fast. My hands want to shake. But I do not let the feeling control me. I notice it, and then I focus on what needs to be done. Veltris thought about this for a long time as they continued their journey. The Shi'ara dealt with fear by avoiding situations that caused it. They accepted their limits and did not push beyond them. It had never occurred to Veltris that you could feel fear and simply choose to ignore it. Humans, he was learning, had a very different way of facing the universe. They were attacked 16 more times before they reached Haven Colony. Each battle was worse than the last. The Vareth knew someone was trying to slip through their lines, and they were sending more and more ships to find them. Lucky was hit again and again. Their shields failed twice. Their engines nearly died once. They ran out of ammunition for the main guns and had to use the backup weapons, which were weaker and slower. But Daniel never gave up. When their communications array was destroyed, Daniel rebuilt it using parts from his own prosthetic leg. He limped for days afterward, but they could talk to the outside world again. When their navigation computer crashed, Daniel calculated their course by hand, using math and star charts and memories of routes he had flown years ago. When Veltris was injured by an explosion in the engine room, Daniel treated his wounds with skills he had learned from watching the medical team during his recovery. Veltris began to understand something about humans during those long, terrible days. They were not strong because they did not break. They were strong because they could be broken again and still keep going. On the 12th day, they finally saw Haven Colony. The planet hung in space before them. A blue and green world that looked peaceful from a distance. But as they got closer, Veltris could see the flashes of weapons fire in orbit. The Vareth fleet had arrived. There were hundreds of ships surrounding the colony. Massive warships, fast destroyers, troop carriers loaded with soldiers ready to land. The human defense fleet was tiny by comparison, maybe 20 ships fighting desperately to hold the line. We are too late, Veltris said quietly. The invasion has already begun. Daniel stared at the tactical display. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Veltris thought he would finally see the human accept defeat. Instead, Daniel started to smile. Look at the command ship, he said, pointing to the largest Vareth vessel in the center of the fleet. The one with all the communications arrays. Veltris looked. What about it? The Vareth use a centralized command structure. Everything goes through that ship. Orders, coordination, tactical data. If that ship goes down, the entire fleet loses direction. That ship is in the middle of an entire invasion fleet. We cannot possibly reach it. Daniel's smile grew wider. Watch me. He started working at his console, pulling up data, running calculations. Veltris watched him with a mixture of horror and fascination. You are planning to attack the command ship, Veltris said. With this ship? This tiny, damaged, barely flying ship. Not attack, Daniel said. Land. The command ship has a hangar bay on its underside. If we come in fast enough, and if we come in at exactly the right angle, we can slip through their shields before they close. And then what? Daniel looked up at him. His brown eyes were burning with determination. Then we go inside and we break everything. Veltris stared at the human. He thought about all the reasons this plan would not work. He thought about the probability of success, which had to be near zero. He thought about the logical, sensible thing to do, which was to turn around and flee while they still could. Then he thought about the last 6 months. He thought about watching Daniel walk when he should never have walked. He thought about watching Daniel fight when he should have died. He thought about what it meant to be human, to refuse to accept limits, to look at impossible odds, and simply decide that you would beat them anyway. Veltris took a deep breath. He gripped the controls of the ship. "Tell me where to fly," he said. Daniel grinned. "Straight down their throat." Lucky dove toward the invasion fleet, one tiny ship against an armada. And Veltris, for the first time in his long life, felt like he was truly alive. Lucky screamed through the void, diving straight toward the heart of the Vareth fleet. Veltris had never flown like this before. He pushed the little ship beyond every limit it had, weaving between massive warships, dodging streams of weapons fire, spinning through explosions that bloomed like flowers in the darkness. His hearts were pounding so hard he could hear them in his ears. Daniel sat beside him, working the weapons console with hands that never shook. He fired at sensors, at communications arrays, at anything that might help the enemy track them. He was not trying to destroy the Vareth ships. He was trying to blind them. The command ship grew larger in the viewing window. It was enormous, a mountain of metal and weapons floating in space. Its shields glowed with energy, a barrier that should have stopped anything from getting through. But shields had gaps. Every shield system needed openings for fighters to launch and land. And Daniel had found the gap. "There," Daniel said, pointing at the bottom of the command ship. "The hangar bay. They are launching fighters. The shields will be open for another 30 seconds. 30 seconds. That was all they had. Veltris aimed Lucky at the gap and pushed the engines to maximum. The ship shook around them. Warning alarms screamed. A blast of weapons fire clipped their wing, sending them spinning for a terrible moment before Veltris regained control. 20 seconds. More fighters were launching from the hangar, flying straight toward them. Daniel fired everything they had, creating a wall of energy that scattered the enemy formation. 10 seconds. The hangar bay filled the viewing window, a dark opening in the belly of the command ship. Veltris could see lights inside, the shapes of other ships, the movement of Vareth soldiers running for cover. 5 seconds. Lucky shot through the gap, just as the shields began to close. The edge of the energy barrier scraped against their hull, tearing metal, sending sparks flying. But they were through. They crashed into the hangar bay at full speed. The impact was tremendous. Lucky hit the deck and slid, crashing through equipment and supply crates, throwing sparks everywhere. Veltris was thrown against his restraints so hard he felt something crack in his chest. The world spun around him in a blur of light and sound. Then everything went still. Veltris opened his eyes. Smoke filled the cockpit. Emergency lights flickered red. His body hurt everywhere, but he was alive. "Daniel?" he called out. The human was already unbuckling his restraints. Blood ran down his face from a cut on his forehead, but his eyes were clear and focused. "We made it," Daniel said. He grabbed a weapon from the emergency locker and handed another to Veltris. "Now comes the hard part." They left the ruined ship and entered the command vessel. What followed would become legend across 17 star systems. The Vareth were not prepared for borders. Their security was designed to stop attacks from outside, not from within. Daniel and Veltris moved through the corridors like ghosts, avoiding patrols when they could and fighting through them when they could not. Veltris had not fought hand-to-hand in over a century, but something had awakened in him during the journey here. Something that made him faster, stronger, more determined than he had ever been. He fought beside Daniel with a fury he did not know he possessed. Daniel was a force of nature. He moved through the fight Daniel, Vareth soldiers like water through rocks, flowing around their attacks, striking at weak points, never stopping. His injured leg should have slowed him down. His damaged arm should have made fighting impossible. But Daniel Carter had spent 6 months learning to ignore what should have been. They reached the command bridge in less than an hour. The doors were sealed, guarded by the best soldiers the Vareth had. Daniel looked at the defenses and smiled that same calm smile he had worn throughout every impossible challenge. "Cover me," he said to Veltris. Then he charged. Veltris did not have time to argue. He raised his weapon and fired at the guards, drawing their attention while Daniel dove toward the door controls. Energy blasts filled the air around them. Veltris felt one graze his shoulder, burning through his uniform. He kept firing. Daniel reached the controls and went to work. His fingers flew across the alien interface, finding patterns, breaking codes, doing things that should have been impossible for someone who had never seen Vareth technology before. The doors opened. They burst onto the command bridge together. The Vareth admiral stood at the center of the room, surrounded by his officers. He was tall and armored, with sharp teeth and cold eyes that showed no fear. "You are too late," the admiral said in his rough voice. "My fleet will destroy your colony. Nothing you do here can stop that." Daniel walked toward him. He was limping now, his leg finally giving out from the strain. Blood covered his face and arms. He looked like a man who had crawled out of death itself. "Your fleet depends on this ship for coordination," Daniel said. "Without it, they will not know where to attack. They will not know where to send reinforcements. They will fall apart." He reached the main communication console. "Let us see what happens when the head dies." Daniel's hands moved across the controls. Veltris watched as screens flickered, as alarms began to sound throughout the ship. Daniel was not just disabling the communications. He was destroying them, burning out systems, making sure they could never be repaired. The admiral roared and charged toward Daniel. Veltris intercepted him, tackling the larger warrior to the ground. They struggled, the admiral's strength nearly overwhelming Veltris. But Veltris had something the admiral did not have. He had spent 6 months watching a human, refused to give up. He held on. When Daniel finished his work, the entire Vareth fleet fell into chaos. Without central command, the invasion force did not know what to do. Some ships kept attacking. Others withdrew. Some fired on each other by accident. The human defenders rallied, pushing back against the disorganized enemy. Within hours, reinforcements arrived from neighboring systems. The Vareth were driven back. Haven Colony survived. Veltris found Daniel afterward, sitting in the ruins of the command bridge. The human was exhausted, his body finally giving in to all the punishment it had taken. But he was smiling. "We did it," Daniel said quietly. "You did it," Veltris corrected. "I merely followed." They were rescued by human ships and taken down to the surface of Haven Colony. The colony had been damaged by the early attacks, but it was still standing. People were emerging from shelters, looking up at the sky where the battle had been won. A young woman pushed through the crowd. She had brown hair like Daniel and the same determined eyes. When she saw Daniel, she stopped. Her face went through a dozen emotions in a single second. Then she ran to him and threw her arms around him. "You came back," Katie Carter whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They said you were dead. They said no one survived. But you came back." Daniel held his sister tightly. "I promised," he said simply. "I always keep my promises." Veltris watched them from a distance. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, about all the impossible things he had witnessed. He thought about probability and fate, and what it meant to accept your limits. Daniel looked up and saw him watching. He gently released his sister and walked over to stand before Veltris. "Commander," Daniel said, "is your duty fulfilled now?" Veltris considered the question. He thought about the cold mathematics he had lived by for 200 years. He thought about accepting fate, about finding peace in what was rather than fighting for what could be. He thought about everything he had believed before meeting this human. "My duty ended long ago," Veltris said. "What kept me here was something else. I wanted to see how your story would end." Daniel laughed. It was a warm sound, full of life and joy. "Stories like mine do not end," he said. "They just find new chapters." Veltris looked at the sunrise over Haven Colony. The light was warm on his scales. Around them, humans were celebrating, laughing, crying, holding each other. They had faced destruction and survived. He understood something in that moment, something his species had never grasped in all their centuries of careful wisdom. Destiny was not a force to be calculated. It was not a weight to be accepted. It was not an enemy to be feared. Destiny was a challenge. And humans. Veltris now knew, never backed down from a challenge. He looked at Daniel Carter, this broken man who had rebuilt himself through sheer will, who had flown through fire and fought against impossible odds, who had kept a promise even when the universe itself seemed determined to stop him. "What will you do now?" Veltris asked. Daniel smiled and put his arm around his sister. "Now I live," he said, "and I find the next challenge. That is what humans do." Veltris nodded slowly. He had spent 200 years thinking he understood the universe. He had been wrong. The universe did not belong to those who accepted their fate. It belonged to those who dared to defy it. And standing on that colony world, watching the sun rise over a future that should never have existed, Veltris made a decision. He would not return to his old life of acceptance and peace. He would stay here with these strange, stubborn, impossible humans. He wanted to see what other miracles they could create. The story was not over. It was only beginning.